He called her a liar on live television, in front of the cameras, the country, and Congress. With a smirk, a finger pointed, and a voice soaked in mockery, Donald Trump thought it would end there, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would flinch, fold, or fire back with fury. But she didn't raise her voice. She reached into a slim red folder, pressed a single button, and let the room hear what no one expected. His voice, his words, unedited, undeniable. In that moment, the room didn't explode. It froze. America didn't cheer. It listened, because when the powerful lie, it takes more than outrage to reveal the truth. Sometimes it only takes someone brave enough to press play. This story is a dramatization, a fictional retelling inspired by real voices, real tensions, and a very real hunger for accountability. The characters are public figures, the events imagined, but the emotions, the questions it asks, those are all painfully real. Now let's begin. It was the kind of morning that rarely makes headlines. Capitol Hill stirred in quiet rhythm, heels tapping on marble, low voices carrying half-formed thoughts, coffee cooling too fast in paper cups. The Oversight Committee was gathering again, and though the room filled with chatter and clipped expectations, no one really believed today would be different. Trump was on the schedule. That in itself brought attention, but not surprise. He arrived with the usual cadence of cameras, a few handshakes, a raised chin, that practiced smile he'd worn through campaigns and scandals. Familiar, predictable. Some said he looked confident. Others said smug. Either way, it wasn't new. A producer from MSNBC leaned toward her colleague. Bet you a muffin he calls someone disrespectful before the hour's out. Just past 9, the last chair remained unoccupied. And then, without announcement, without even a glance from the gallery, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped in. No staffers rushed behind her. No flash of cameras followed. She moved gently, almost slowly, as though the pace of the room didn't apply to her. In her hand, a thin red folder worn at the edges. The kind of folder that had traveled, not just from office to office, but through thought, through time, through intent. She didn't look at anyone, didn't need to. She found her seat at the end of the panel and sat without a word. To most, it was nothing. Just another member arriving, just another stack of papers. But to those who'd watched her closely over the years, something felt different. Quieter, maybe. More settled. Like the stillness before a storm. Not loud, but inevitable. She opened her folder. Inside, a single yellow notepad, 3 sticky tabs, and something metal tucked carefully between pages. Her aide, seated 2 rows behind, tilted her head just slightly. A whisper. Did she tell you what's in it? A reply. Only that it matters. Across the table, Trump leaned back, eyes drifting. He didn't speak her name, but he saw her. And just for a second, so quick most wouldn't catch it, his gaze settled on that folder. Red, unassuming, closed. AOC didn't speak. She didn't fidget. She didn't scroll her phone like others on the panel. She simply sat, pen uncapped, as if waiting for a clock only she could hear. No tension, no rush, just stillness. And that stillness did something no opening statement ever could. It unsettled, because in a room built for performance, she wasn't performing. She was preparing. What no one knew, not yet, was that tucked inside that folder wasn't a speech or a question. It wasn't a headline waiting to happen. It was a moment, a small, quiet moment, ready to unfold when the room least expected it. And it wouldn't come with shouting, or accusations, or fury. It would come with a voice, his. Some days begin like any other, but not all days stay that way. Later, they would call this the day everything changed. But in that moment, it was just a folder, a woman, and a silence that already knew what was coming. He entered the chamber like someone returning to familiar ground, not as a guest, but as a man convinced the walls still owed him their silence. Republicans rose first, smiling too widely, clapping too quickly, voices suddenly louder as if to fill the awkwardness of what his presence actually meant. There was a strange choreography to it all, a kind of practiced reverence that didn't quite reach the eyes. They called him Mr. President, even now. He nodded in return, smug, slow, measured like someone enjoying the weight of his own legend. Cameras followed every turn of his shoulders. His grin landed just as the shutters clicked. For a moment it felt like 2016 all over again, like nothing had changed. He settled into his seat at the center, flanked by aides who tried too hard to look unbothered. The air around them shifted, not with tension, but something more careful, calculated. They knew how this usually went. But further down the panel, near the edge of the long table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat differently. She hadn't stood when he entered. She hadn't offered a glance or a nod. Her stillness didn't feel like protest. It felt like intention. A quiet murmur passed between two staffers seated behind the Republican side. One leaned in just slightly, barely above a breath. She won't get a word in today. It wasn't cruel, just tired confidence. The kind that forgets silence can be its own preparation. AOC didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened the red folder slowly, not for show, but as if she'd done it 100 times before, and the weight inside was heavier than it looked. There were only 3 items tucked within: a memo folded once, a yellow sticky note bearing a timestamp, and something small, matte black, pressed flat between the pages. A voice recorder, compact, quiet, waiting. She didn't touch it, not yet. Her fingers lingered over the memo instead, eyes skimming the paragraphs, not like someone reading for the first time, but like someone making sure the words were still where she remembered them to be. She circled something gently with her pen. Her face remained unreadable. The session hadn't even begun, but already the room had divided itself. On one end, deference. On the other, discipline. Trump adjusted his cufflinks. One aide leaned over to whisper something in his ear, and he chuckled. Loud enough to be noticed, but not enough to be questioned. He looked at the panel, scanning faces like a man ticking boxes. When his gaze landed briefly on AOC, he paused. Just a beat. No expression crossed his face, but he looked at the folder and then looked away. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't show it. What struck those watching, those who knew how to pay attention, wasn't the absence of interaction. It was the presence of something else, something quiet, a boundary drawn not with anger, but with certainty. AOC capped her pen. The sticky note with the timestamp was now pressed lightly against the recorder, a soft alignment no one else would see. The room was still speaking over itself, still posturing, but beneath it all, something had already shifted. Sometimes the loudest moment in the room is the one no one realizes has begun. And sometimes the people who say the least walk in with everything they need. She didn't have to read the notes again. But she did, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. A habit formed not in hearing rooms, but in cramped corners of the Bronx, where a missed comma could cost someone their apartment, where a wrong date could decide who got to stay and who got left behind. AOC's handwriting was neat, though a little slanted, the kind that looked rushed but carried rhythm. On the legal pad before her, only 3 lines were underlined. One of them was a quote, verbatim. Another, a date, July 8th. The third, a time code, 11:16 a.m. She traced each with her fingertip once, as if anchoring herself to something more solid than the room around her. Across the long, polished table, Trump adjusted his tie, then his cuff, then his chair. It wasn't nervousness. He didn't seem like a man prone to that. It was more like a performance, one he'd done 100 times. The slight overcorrection in posture, the practiced nods to cameras, the small, self-assured grin that came just before the microphones turned on. He didn't glance at his notes. He rarely did. To most in the room, it looked like confidence, familiarity, control. But to AOC, it looked like someone who had never been asked to answer, only to talk. The chairman called the session to order. Papers shuffled. Laptops clicked open. A young intern ran an extra copy of an agenda down the aisle, nearly tripping on the edge of a reporter's bag. All the usual motions. But none of it settled her heartbeat, not because she was afraid, but because something irreversible was about to begin, and it wouldn't start with her voice. It would start with his. The voice on the recording didn't shout. It didn't slur or stumble. It was clear, steady, delivered with the kind of careless ease that powerful people often reserve for rooms they assume no one else will ever hear. She'd listened to it 3 times before, not to confirm it was real, but to remember the silence after it ended. The kind of silence that doesn't come from microphones being cut, but from people realizing they just heard the truth, unfiltered. Trump adjusted his chair again. His lawyer leaned in, whispered something. He nodded, smiled, leaned back, still relaxed, still convinced the moment belonged to him. AOC closed her folder gently. She didn't bring pages of talking points. She didn't bring graphs or quotes or dramatic flair. Just a folded memo, a time-stamped note, and a black recorder, no bigger than her palm. What she carried wasn't volume, it was timing. She glanced up once, not to meet anyone's gaze, but to take in the room, the weight of it, the structure, the ceremony that so often masked indifference. And then her eyes landed on the speaker system mounted above the dais, one she had looked past 100 times before. Funny how something so ordinary could become the line between noise and clarity. She exhaled, once, lightly, and that was it. She didn't come to fight him with fire. She came to let the air do the work, because sometimes you don't need a sword, you just need to press play. The hearing had settled into its usual rhythm. Statements were made, questions rehearsed, and answers delivered like lines from a stage play no one really believed in anymore. A few members leaned back, already checking their phones beneath the desk. Some had stopped pretending to take notes altogether. And then Trump was asked about immigration. The question came from a colleague across the aisle. Measured, respectful, almost toothless. It offered him a wide lane to pivot, and he took it with practiced ease. He leaned toward the mic, nodded solemnly, and spoke of compassion, of families, of fairness, of how no one had done more to secure the border humanely than he had. He used words like safe, structured, legal pathways. He called himself misunderstood, misrepresented, a man burdened by difficult decisions for the sake of national unity, and the room let him talk. For almost 2 full minutes, he painted a version of himself that sounded nothing like the man voters had watched on debate stages, or the one who had tweeted policy between TV segments. But here, under oath, he wore a gentler tone. He even said the word empathy. It would have passed, until her voice entered. AOC didn't rush, didn't pounce. When the chair yielded her the floor, she took a quiet breath before speaking, just enough to shift the air in the room without calling attention to it. Mr. Trump, she began, tone even, almost warm. I want to make sure I understand your position clearly. You're saying that in your conversations, public and private, you've always spoken about immigrants with respect? He smiled faintly. Of course. She nodded, jotted something, then lifted her gaze, not confrontational, but steady. Then just to confirm, she said, her words like soft cloth brushing over glass. You've never, in any closed-door meeting, referred to immigrants as, quote, losers? There it was. A small ripple moved through the room. Not loud, not even audible, but it shifted posture. Shoulders straightened, pens stilled. Trump scoffed, shaking his head. That's fake news, he replied, with a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. A total lie. I never said that. Never would. A few Republican members leaned in, preparing to nod supportively. One even smiled, already readying a soundbite for friendly media. It was exactly the answer they expected. Firm, dismissive, laced with the right level of indignation. AOC simply blinked. She didn't argue. She didn't react. She just let his words hang. Trump adjusted his sleeve, confident he'd swatted away a routine jab. To him it was nothing. One more accusation denied. One more moment survived. But her silence wasn't retreat. It was remembering. Because she hadn't asked for drama. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't built a case yet. All she'd done was place a single word, losers, into the record. And more importantly, into the ears of every person watching. She lowered her pen and smiled, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. Some questions aren't meant to trap. They're meant to echo. And the loudest echoes often follow the quietest truths. She didn't raise her voice. She raised a document. With quiet precision, AOC reached into the red folder and retrieved a folded memo. The paper wasn't dramatic. No big red stamps, no screaming headlines. Just a plain page with standard formatting, a header, a date, July 8th, and several sentences beneath it that seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. But she had read them enough times to know exactly which lines mattered. "I'd like to enter into the record an internal policy briefing summary," she said calmly, offering a copy to the clerk. "Circulated following a meeting held at the Eisenhower Conference Room on July 8th of last year." She paused, not for effect, but for focus. "In the third paragraph," she continued, eyes scanning the text with the steadiness of someone who already knew where she was going, "there's a line that reads, quote, 'The former president made clear his stance that accommodating certain immigrant populations, particularly those deemed economically dependent, would, in his words, reward losers.'" She didn't look up right away. She let the room take in the words without framing them. When she finally lifted her gaze, it wasn't toward the cameras. It was toward him. Trump shifted slightly, rolled his eyes, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed, then leaned toward the mic with a quick exhale that sounded like a half laugh. "That's a mischaracterization," he said, hand waving slightly, as though dismissing a smudge on a window. She tilted her head, not in challenge, but in curiosity. "How so?" she asked softly. He leaned back. "You're twisting it. I said something about strategy, about prioritizing skilled labor. That line, you're pulling it out of context. You people do that all the time." There it was again. You people. The deflection, the turn. She didn't blink. Instead, she opened a small notebook in front of her. It had 2 tabs marked in green. She flipped to the first. "So just to be clear," she said, her tone still even, "you're denying the language referenced here entirely? That you never in any version of that meeting used the word losers in connection to immigrant populations?" He looked annoyed now. 100%. Never said it. "And the term economically dependent, did you use that?" "I may have said something about the economy, but not in the way you're suggesting. This is a spin." She wrote something down, 1 line. Across the room, no one said a word. It was the stillness that began to spread first, not outrage, not disbelief, but a kind of attentive quiet. The kind that only forms when people sense something else might be coming. A layer beneath the one just shown. She didn't say what she was thinking. Not yet. Because this wasn't the moment to debate his memory. It was the moment to seal his words. Verbatim. The danger of denying something publicly isn't just that it might not be true. It's that if someone's prepared, that denial becomes the beginning, not the end, of what's about to unfold. The air in the chamber had stilled, not heavy, not loud, but suspended, as if even the light knew to wait. AOC didn't speak again right away. She let his last words rest in the open like an unguarded window. "I never said those words." There was no echo, just a faint scratch of someone's pen 2 rows back. The committee chair, sensing an opening to move things along, asked if the former president would be willing to formally affirm his denial. Trump, looking vaguely pleased with himself, nodded. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he waved him off. He was comfortable now, convinced the storm had passed before it ever truly began. A staffer approached with a prepared affirmation form, routine for high-profile hearings. Trump leaned forward, uncapped a pen that wasn't his, and signed it with a practiced flourish. His signature spanned the line like a billboard, big, jagged, self-assured. He leaned back, arms crossed, the faint trace of a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. To him, it was over. He'd dismissed it, discredited it, and now put his denial into the record. On paper, under oath. He thought he had sealed something shut. AOC didn't shift in her seat. She didn't smirk, didn't look at anyone else for affirmation. Her eyes remained on the memo in front of her, now folded in half and pushed gently to the side. She uncapped her pen again, not to underline, not to write, but simply to hold. A steady gesture, quiet and natural. Then just as calmly, she looked up and addressed the chair. "Thank you," she said. Her voice didn't rise or stretch. It moved like water around stone. "I'd like to enter one additional item into the record." There was a pause, not procedural but perceptive. No one interrupted her. No one rushed to ask what it was. AOC reached slowly into her red folder. There were no theatrics to the motion, no sharp movements or sweeping reveals. Just a small, deliberate action, pulling out a compact matte black voice recorder that fit neatly in her palm. She placed it gently on the table. No one breathed louder than necessary. Across the panel, one of the aides behind a Republican member leaned forward slightly, as if to see better. On the far end, a journalist blinked twice and lowered his phone, instinctively sensing that whatever was coming didn't need filters or edits. Trump glanced at the device and then at her. Confused but not yet concerned. She didn't rush. Her fingers rested beside it, steady, as if asking permission from no one but herself. And in that moment, something shifted. Not visibly, not for everyone at once, but deep beneath the surface. The kind of shift that doesn't shake the room, but the ground it sits on. She said nothing more, because there was nothing left to ask. He had given his answer. He had put it in writing, and she had brought what came after. Some people speak to fill silence. Others wait for silence to speak for them. And when it does, it doesn't argue. It plays back. There was no fanfare, no clearing of the throat, no warning, just the soft click of a thumb pressing down. The recorder made no dramatic noise, no beep, no chime, only a subtle shift in presence, like the first note of a song that needs no introduction. And then came his voice, not distorted, not clipped, not rephrased, clear, confident, familiar. I don't care what they lose. We're not here to save losers. That sentence didn't explode. It unfolded, slowly, methodically, like a match lit in a quiet room. The temperature didn't rise, but the air tightened. The kind of tightness people feel just before something breaks, not from sound, but from meaning. No one moved. Not the clerks, not the aides, not the senators shifting in their seats. Even the cameras, usually sweeping and restless, seemed to pause mid-pan, as if unsure where to look. Across the room, someone lowered their pen and didn't pick it back up again. AOC didn't flinch. She had heard it enough times to know what came next. The tone of the voice, the cadence of the cruelty, the practiced detachment of someone so used to being heard that they no longer cared how it sounded. They come here with nothing, expect everything. Weak, entitled, not our problem. The tape didn't shout, but somehow it cut louder than anything said before it. Trump didn't speak. He hadn't expected to need to. But now the weight of his own voice pressed into the room like an invisible hand. Some in the room looked at him, waiting for denial, for outrage, for any sign of explanation. But he stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, like someone trying to remember if what he just heard was real, or worse, if it had been recorded somewhere else too. The audio continued. People don't vote for sympathy. They vote for strength. If we start bending for the bottom, we'll be buried with them. Another line, another shift. Someone at the back of the gallery audibly inhaled. A soft gasp, barely audible, but it carried. The chairman blinked twice, unsure whether to speak or wait. But AOC remained seated, unmoved, her fingers resting gently against the edge of the desk, as if steadying the table itself. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because this wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a mirror. And for the first time, the reflection didn't blink. There were no reactions from her side of the aisle, no smirks, no applause, just silence. The kind that draws out every word that came before it and sets it gently in front of the public. They knew what they were doing when they came here. Let them live with it. The tape ended, not abruptly, just quietly, like it had said enough. And for a few long seconds, nothing replaced it. No talking, no movement, not even the soft tapping of laptop keys. Only the kind of stillness that settles in when something is undeniable. AOC reached forward and pressed stop. That was all. No speech, no follow-up question, no need. There are moments in politics when power comes from force, but this wasn't one of them. This was the kind of moment that redefined silence, not as absence, but as evidence. A silence lingered even after the recording stopped. It wasn't the kind of silence that asks a question. It was the kind that answers one. Not a chair moved, not a pen scratched. The room sat with what it had just heard. Trump's voice, cold and clipped, dismissing human lives with the word losers. The journalists seated along the far aisle weren't whispering anymore. They were already tapping. First in group chats, then on keyboards. One lifted their phone to capture the moment. C-SPAN's cameras were on, but it was the face of the committee that mattered now. And on every face, the same expression. Not shock, not disbelief, but clarity. The kind that arrives after doubt can no longer hide. A staffer from NPR stepped into the hall and made a short call. Moments later, 3 audio engineers huddled near a laptop at the side of the chamber, working quietly, confirming what others already knew in their gut. The tape was real. The voice was verified. The timestamp was cross-checked with visitor logs from that same July meeting. It all lined up, word by word, frame by frame. Trump, who had sat smug and centered earlier, now shifted uneasily. His fingers twitched at the mic stand, not to adjust it, but to find something solid. He let out a half laugh, forced and sharp. "This is taken totally out of context," he said. "You all know that." But no one moved to nod. AOC didn't speak. She didn't need to. She sat still, her hands folded in front of her, gaze steady. Not triumphant, not mocking, just quiet. It was a silence that carried weight. Behind her, a staffer whispered something, but she didn't respond. She kept her eyes ahead, letting the moment breathe. And in that breath, the room rearranged itself, not physically, but in perception. Something had shifted. For viewers watching across the country, the headline wasn't just about a tape. It was about contrast, about tone, about how someone could hold power without raising their voice. Republicans fidgeted. Some scribbled notes. A few leaned away from their microphones as if distance might grant them escape. But the words had already landed, and no one could unhear them. In a back corner, a Fox News producer on a Bluetooth earpiece was already relaying instructions. "Do not cut away, let it roll. We'll figure out framing later." Outside the chamber, tweets began flooding timelines. She had the tape. He denied it under oath. "Did you hear what he actually said?" Inside, the chairman cleared his throat and asked if anyone had questions. None were offered, not yet. Everyone was still recalibrating. Trump leaned into the mic again. "I've always said we need strong borders, but I've also always said we love people." AOC tilted her head slightly, not as a challenge, but as if hearing something far away. He was still trying to control the room, to shift the attention, but the center of gravity had moved. In every viral moment, there's a pause where history asks, will this pass or will it stay? This one stayed, and yet AOC still said nothing. Her restraint was louder than his defense. She didn't argue. She didn't spike the moment. She just let it hang, because she knew the tape was never the point. The point was what happened after the truth plays, and in that silence, America was listening. He didn't wait for the gavel. He didn't wait for closing remarks. The moment the soundbite echoed its last syllable, Trump rose from his chair like a man walking away from a fire. Except this time, he had lit the match himself. The room hadn't yet caught up with what had happened, but his instincts had. He was leaving. A staffer scrambled behind him, scooping up a thick binder that had slipped from the table, pages of talking points fluttering like broken wings across the floor. The binder landed with a dull thud, louder than it should have been. No one bent to help. Cameras followed. Flashes stung. His suit jacket flared as he turned sharply toward the hallway, jaw clenched, not in anger, but calculation. He needed to exit before the moment solidified into legacy. Inside the hearing room, no one spoke. Not immediately. Not because they didn't have thoughts, but because the silence had weight now. The kind that presses against your ribcage. The kind that leaves you breathless, not from shock, but from recognition. AOC sat still. She didn't follow him with her eyes. She just quietly closed the red folder on her desk and slid it an inch away from her. Her hand lingered on it for a second, almost gently, like sealing something shut. Not just the evidence, but the phase that came before it. Outside, the world was already moving faster than the room. #SheHitPlay was trending within minutes. The clip, 21 seconds long, had been clipped and reshared with subtitles in 5 languages. A slowed-down version hit TikTok before the hearing even adjourned. In one frame, you could see AOC's fingers tapping once on the table, just before pressing the button. That tap became a meme. That pause, a movement. Cable news scrambled for reaction panels, but none could outpace the speed of silence that now carried its own momentum. They tried to frame it with urgency, but the internet had already dubbed it history. One headline read, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the room." Another simply said, "The recorder beat the roar." Inside, the chairman shuffled his papers awkwardly, unsure if they should call a recess or keep going. Technically, Trump hadn't been dismissed, but then again, technically, everything had just changed. Across from AOC, a few members whispered. One nudged a colleague, eyebrows raised as if to say, did she know it would land like that? But she wasn't basking. She wasn't even blinking more than usual. Her face was calm, serene even. She had prepared for a moment. What she didn't need to prepare for was what came after. That part wasn't performance, it was presence. A staffer leaned down and asked in a low voice, "Should we issue a statement?" AOC turned to her, eyes steady. "Not yet," she said softly. "Let the room speak first." And it did. Not in applause, not in outrage, but in a hush that didn't beg to be broken. Someone in the back row murmured, "The damage wasn't the words, it was the silence after." And in that stillness, a truth lingered, not because it had been spoken, but because it had been heard. Not shouted, not spun, just played. And nothing echoes longer than what doesn't need to be repeated. The hearing room may have emptied, but the internet had just sat up in bed, eyes wide open. Within 30 minutes of the clip airing, someone on TikTok had slowed down the moment AOC tapped the table and overlaid it with the sound of a ticking clock. Boom, boom, until the word "losers" spilled from the speaker. That version alone crossed 500,000 views before midnight. Then came the edits. Piano underscores, heartbeat effects, black and white filters with the words, "History isn't always loud." YouTube channels reacted instantly. Some paused every frame like a crime scene breakdown. One creator played the soundbite 10 times in a row, each time zooming in tighter on Trump's expression, his blink rate, his jawline twitch. Another posted a 5-minute meditation loop of just AOC pressing the play button, captioned, "Strength is restraint." Podcasts that usually spent Mondays recapping entertainment gossip scrapped their schedules and recorded emergency episodes titled things like "When Truth Hits Like That" or "The Silence Heard Round the World." But it wasn't just left-leaning circles. Conservatives tuned in too. Some dismissed it as theater. Others leaned forward and rewatched with a longer breath than usual. One commentator, known for his usual combative tone, simply whispered, "She played the tape." The video moved fast, but the impact moved slower. It seeped into kitchens and break rooms and group chats and car radios. People didn't all agree on what it meant, but they all agreed on one thing. It had happened. There was no editing around it, no rephrasing, no spinning the tone, just a line, a play button, and then quiet. An older veteran in Kansas posted a Facebook status. "I didn't vote for her, still don't agree with her, but she didn't yell. She just let him talk." That takes more guts than most folks realize. It was shared over 10,000 times before dawn. A barista in Chicago wore a pin the next day, #SheHitPlay. No explanation, just the hashtag. And then came the remix culture. One high school senior mashed the soundbite into a beat that landed on SoundCloud's trending page. "Losers, they said it." It wasn't mocking. It felt more like protest in headphones. A Gen Z teacher in California printed out the transcript of the moment and taped it on her classroom wall next to the words, "Context is a cage. Let the facts walk free." Even late-night comedy paused its usual punchlines. One host stood still after replaying the clip, then looked into the camera and simply said, "That wasn't performance. That was preparation." Some laughed, others went quiet, but neither could look away. And perhaps that was the most unexpected part of all. That in a media age so saturated with outrage, it wasn't volume that won the night. It wasn't spin or spectacle. It was a moment of stillness, clear, simple, undistorted. A truth didn't have to be shouted to be felt. It just had to be heard. And now it was everywhere. The clip didn't just live online. It slipped quietly into homes, slipped past politics and into something more intimate. Kitchen tables, couches, text threads shared between people who rarely talked about Washington unless it involved taxes or the price of gas. In a modest house in Fayetteville, Arkansas, a retired Marine sat beside his teenage daughter. He hadn't planned on watching the full hearing, but the clip found its way to him. At first, he watched out of curiosity. By the end, he didn't move. His daughter glanced over and asked what he thought. He didn't answer right away. He just rewound the moment and played it again. That, he said finally, is what truth sounds like when it doesn't ask permission. In Grand Rapids, a nurse finishing the night shift opened her phone and saw the headline. She tapped play while waiting for her coffee to brew. 5 minutes later, she forwarded the clip to a former coworker who had once told her politics made her tired. This time, the message came with only 3 words. You'll want this. In a church basement in rural Oklahoma, a conservative pastor set down his tablet after watching the video on silent. He didn't tell the congregation, but later in a small Bible study group, he closed his notes halfway through and said softly, I think we need to ask ourselves who exactly we've been following. The room went still. No debate, just a few deep breaths and the shuffling of chairs as the session ended a little earlier than usual. In Los Angeles, a high school civics teacher added a surprise discussion prompt to the next day's board. When a microphone does more than a megaphone, what just happened? Students didn't all agree, but none of them looked away. That alone was a shift. At a diner in Georgia, 2 old friends, one Democrat, one Republican, passed a phone back and forth, watching in silence. When it ended, one said, You know, I don't like how she talks sometimes. The other just nodded. Then the first one whispered, But this, she didn't talk much at all, and somehow that hit harder. They didn't argue. They just asked the waitress for another round of coffee and sat a little longer. A librarian in Vermont printed the transcript, folded it into a stack of civic reading materials. Someone else borrowed it before lunch. It didn't return that afternoon. In one home, a teenage boy showed the clip to his grandfather. A man who never missed a State of the Union, but hadn't watched a congressional hearing in a decade. The old man smiled, not because of what was said, but because of how it was delivered. She didn't raise her voice, he murmured. She just didn't flinch. And in the quiet that followed, families didn't always say much. But you could feel the questions forming, not the kind that demanded answers right away, but the kind that lingered. Was that real? Why didn't anyone else say it first? If it was true, what does that say about the people we've defended? Not everyone flipped their beliefs. Not everyone rushed to share or praise. But something subtle changed. The tone at the table, the pause before the next sentence, the way people leaned into the screen instead of away. Because once a truth like that is heard, simple, quiet, undeniable, it echoes, not in the headlines, in the homes. Inside Mar-a-Lago, the atmosphere was thick with heat, not from the Florida sun, but from the fury behind closed doors. Staffers who had once walked the gilded hallways with confidence now exchanged glances laced with caution. No one wanted to be called into the main room. They all knew what was coming. The double doors slammed shut behind him. Aides braced themselves. Trump was livid, not the performative kind he often wielded for headlines. This was personal. Raw, splintered, he gripped the edge of the table and barked at everyone in reach. Who let that tape out? Who the hell knew about it? They tried to explain. It wasn't from their end. It was internal government audio, surfaced through congressional procedure. Nothing leaked, but he wasn't listening. Facts were inconvenient now. Rage was easier. Phones buzzed across the room. He'd already posted on Truth Social. Fake tape, made up by the Dems. AOC is the enemy of the people? 3 typos, all caps, an extra exclamation mark. Someone whispered, maybe take it down and reword it. They were ignored. He posted again 5 minutes later, this time spelling her name wrong. Meanwhile, senior advisors were scrambling, not just to contain the digital wildfire, but to brace for the next press conference. One aide, barely out of law school, murmured to another, He's not angry because it was a lie. He's angry because it was a woman who cornered him, and she didn't even raise her voice. The older staffers didn't disagree, but no one said it out loud. Across the mansion, communications personnel tried to write a new statement. Something about context, maybe an unfair ambush or weaponized audio, but none of it landed. Every draft sounded smaller than the moment, less credible than the clarity of that recording. One staffer, eyes red from lack of sleep, stared at the screen and asked quietly, "What if the problem isn't the tape? What if it's that people believed her?" The question hung in the air like smoke. They all knew the answer, even if no one dared speak it. In the days before, they joked about the hearing, called it a warm-up round. No one had considered her a threat. She wasn't a prosecutor. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She just asked. And now, the internet was flooded, not with partisan rage, but with stunned silence, with side-by-side clips, with slowed-down replays of the moment the play button was pressed. Back in the room, Trump threw a file across the desk, pages scattered on the floor. One aide knelt to pick them up but stopped when she saw what they were. Briefing memos from last week, bullet-pointed notes suggesting they avoid detailed questions on immigration tone. She glanced up. No one else was moving. A strategist finally broke the silence. "We can still spin this." Another one answered, "Not if people already felt it before they heard it," because that was the truth they couldn't contain. Not the audio itself, but the resonance. The confirmation of something many had suspected but never expected to hear so clearly. And in that golden room, for the first time in a long time, their playbook didn't work. Because the person who had outmaneuvered him hadn't done it with volume. She'd done it with patience, precision, a recording, a question, and timing no war room could predict. Not everything that shakes power comes with thunder. Sometimes it comes with a pause. And the moment you realize you've been outplayed by someone who never raised their voice. Long before committee rooms and microphones, there was a cramped apartment in the Bronx with a leaky faucet and a pile of unopened mail on the kitchen table. That's where it really began. Not the headlines, but the habit. Alexandria remembers that table vividly. It had scratches that told stories, stains from too many hurried dinners, and a drawer always stuck at the edge. That's where the papers sat, folded, official-looking, and unreadable to her mother. Legal English had a way of sounding like a threat, even when it wasn't. She was 10 the first time she picked up an envelope marked in red. Her mother's face had gone still, staring at it like it was written in another language, because it was. So AOC sat down, sounding out every word. "Failure to remit may result in removal." She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. The rent was late, again, and someone was coming. That night she didn't sleep. She sat with a dictionary and the notice, circling unfamiliar terms, whispering them aloud like they were part of a secret code. No one had taught her how to fight yet, but the page became her first battlefield, and reading her first act of rebellion. By 13, she was filling out school forms for cousins. By 15, she was helping her mother appeal a billing error from the power company. Not because she loved the paperwork, but because it meant her mother didn't have to cry at the counter again. Slowly, she learned the strange rhythms of bureaucracy, what words meant wait and what meant no, and how some phrases were meant to confuse, not to clarify. She didn't say it out loud then, but something grew from those nights. A quiet kind of determination, the kind that doesn't roar. It builds. Every clause she decoded, every letter she translated, made her feel less like a kid and more like a compass. She couldn't make the world fair, but maybe she could make it legible. Years later, standing in front of lawmakers, she still remembered how her hands used to shake holding eviction letters. That memory never left. Not because of the fear, but because of what it taught her. That silence in the face of confusion is how power wins. And that breaking that silence, even with just a sentence, is its own form of revolution. So when people asked where her grit came from, she didn't point to protests or podiums. She pointed to that table, that stack of unread notices, that first time her mother handed her a form and said, "Mija, can you read this for me?" Because in that moment, without knowing it, Her mother handed her more than paper. She handed her purpose. And now when she sits across from someone with more power or more privilege, she doesn't see intimidation. She sees the fine print, and she reads it slowly for everyone who never got the chance. After the hearing, her office was quiet in that oddly sacred way, where no one dared speak too soon, like the walls were still listening. AOC stood near the window, arms gently folded, eyes scanning nothing in particular. Her aide hovered nearby, unsure if now was the time for debriefs or just silence. She turned slightly, almost sensing the question unspoken. "I didn't release it to corner him," she said softly. "I released it because people needed to hear what they're often not meant to." It wasn't an ambush. It was a mirror. And she knew mirrors didn't flatter. They revealed. The clip was real. But so was the damage policies like his could cause when left unquestioned. It was never just about language. It was about how language shaped law, how words uttered behind closed doors, carelessly or cruelly, found their way into drafts, bills, budgets. How a sentence said in arrogance could become a policy signed in ink. Her aide nodded slowly, processing, still a little surprised at how calm she'd been through it all. No gloating, no viral smirk, just that steady voice, that razor-sharp phrasing, that quiet steel people often misread as softness. AOC walked over to her desk and slid open a drawer. Inside, there wasn't much. A photo of her family, a folded flyer from her first campaign, and a worn sticky note that simply read, "Don't fight for the fight. Fight for the fix." She had written it years ago, on a day full of frustration and red tape, and somehow it still anchored her. That reminder that the goal wasn't to be right louder, but to make the truth clearer. "We don't get second chances with policy," she repeated, more to herself this time. "People don't get to rewind pain just because we missed something in committee." That's what she carried with her. Not pride, not revenge, but all the names of people she'd met who couldn't afford for the system to figure it out later. Parents with deportation letters in their mailboxes. Veterans denied care over paperwork errors. Kids who translated court documents for their families. They didn't need spectacle. They needed someone who refused to let moments slide into memory without consequence. She hadn't planned to use the recording that day. She'd hoped maybe he'd own up to it, offer context, or at least honesty. But when the denial came, full and unflinching, she didn't flinch either. Her weapon, as always, wasn't volume. It was clarity, that piercing kind that doesn't wound, but wakes. The aide finally asked hesitantly, "Do you think it made a difference?" AOC looked over, a faint smile forming. If it made one person rethink what power should sound like, then yes. Then she turned back to her folder, not rushing, not retreating, just returning to the work, because that's where the real statement always lived. Not in the headlines, but in the habit, in how she kept showing up, tape or no tape, with the same steady hands and the same unwavering why. And quietly, that's what shook the room the most. Not the playback, not the silence after, but the reminder that truth, when spoken without anger, could still make power stumble. The first envelope came with no return address, just her name written in careful cursive, slightly slanted. Inside, a fourth-grade teacher from Iowa included a short note, a drawing from one of her students, crayon on wide-ruled paper. It showed a woman standing in front of a microphone, surrounded by hearts. Underneath the caption, "She told the truth." By the end of the week, the mail bin outside her office was overflowing. Some wrote in long, winding paragraphs. Others sent postcards with barely a sentence. One read, "I'm 82. I've seen a lot of hearings. I've never seen someone walk through fire and not burn others just to prove they could." Another was printed in neat Vietnamese, translated by a local community organizer. A father of three who had worked 2 jobs and still remembered being called less than in court decades ago. AOC sat on the floor of her office with the letters spread out like a soft sea of memory and witness. Aide after aide offered to help sort them. She asked them to leave them as they were. For now, she didn't want to read them with protocol. She wanted to read them with her hands. There was something sacred about the ink smudges, the uneven lines, the underlining of certain words. Thank you. Finally, funny for all of us. She paused at one typed on worn stationery. From a veteran in Pennsylvania, "You didn't raise your voice, but you raised ours. I've spent my life trying to feel heard by a government I served. That moment was the first time I felt like someone was speaking back in our direction." She pressed the letter against her chest gently, as if absorbing something deeper than just ink and paper. It wasn't praise that moved her, it was recognition. That what she carried into that room hadn't just landed, it echoed. Because when she pressed play, she wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to break a cycle, to show that accountability didn't need cruelty and truth didn't need theatrics. That dignity wasn't the opposite of power, it was its rightful form. From a high school student in Nevada came a bright blue envelope filled with notebook paper and glittery gel pen script. "I didn't think politics could feel like someone protecting us. You changed that." She chuckled softly, imagining the nervous excitement that must have gone into choosing the right pen. The courage it took to send something at all. Outside her window, the Capitol buzzed with its usual rotations. Interviews, posturing, spin. But inside, she felt something quieter settling. A thread tying her not just to headlines, but to homes. To dinner tables where the clip played twice. To union halls and nursing homes. To ESL classrooms and pews and quiet morning bus rides where someone pulled up the transcript and read every word. The voices in the letters didn't all agree with her on policy. Some had voted for people who didn't say her name kindly. But still they reached out. Still they wrote, "We saw what you did and how you did it." And in a time where outrage was currency and attention fleeting, that small sentence meant more than 1,000 trending hashtags. She didn't need to be everyone's favorite. She just needed to be someone's reminder. That power can sound different. That leadership doesn't always shout. And that truth, spoken plainly, held gently, can ripple farther than any microphone ever could. It started with a huddle. Not in the main room, not in front of the gold curtains or the fireplace where they usually stage their unity. This time, they met in the windowless media war room under Mar-a-Lago. Phones on silent, aides with coffee gone cold in their hands. Everyone talking too quickly, too nervously, then not at all. The strategist from the Midwest took off his glasses and rubbed the space between his eyes. "Every post he makes just makes it worse." Someone else nodded. Another checked their phone, only to find hashtag "she hit play" trending again, this time over a slowed-down remix layered with violins and closed captions in 5 languages. He said it wasn't his voice, but he didn't say it with conviction. Someone had printed screenshots of the tape being aired on primetime news, circled in red pen like they were reviewing a crime scene. CNN, NBC. Even Fox was now calling it unconfirmed but likely authentic. "Where's the legal team?" one aide asked, a bit too loudly. "Drafting denials. Again." But that wasn't what made the room feel heavier than it should have. What made the silent stretch wasn't just the damage already done. It was the damage they didn't know was coming. That's when the speechwriter, the quiet one who always sat a few chairs from the back, whispered into the silence, "There might be more tapes." The room stiffened. "What do you mean might?" one advisor asked. She played that recording like she'd been waiting for just the right moment, like it wasn't just proof, it was part of a sequence. The Midwest strategist leaned forward. "Like a trap." "No," the speechwriter said slowly. "Like a mirror. One that cracks deeper every time he speaks." Someone tried to shift the tone. "We need to pivot. He should go live. Say it was doctored, emotional moment, misunderstood." But even as they said it, the others knew it wouldn't work. They had seen the look on people's faces. Not the angry ones, not even the gleeful ones, but the quiet ones. The veterans, the nurses, the suburban independents who hadn't flinched in years but now weren't blinking. "She didn't scream. She didn't even accuse," one advisor said aloud, almost as if realizing it for the first time. "She just pressed play and waited." It was the waiting that unsettled them. The restraint, the stillness. It made every word on that tape heavier. And if there were more, if even one other line echoed like that, this wasn't just about public relations. It was about momentum. "He's unraveling in public," someone muttered, watching a new post go up on Truth Social in real time. "The tape is a lie. AOC is a traitor to men. Sad." The speechwriter sighed. The more he yells, the clearer she looks. Someone suggested calling a meeting with donors. Another suggested threatening legal action against the networks playing the tape. But no one said the one thing that hung in the air. They were no longer driving the narrative. For once, they weren't even chasing it. They were stuck in the rear view, watching as someone they had dismissed, mocked, underestimated, stepped into the space they had once controlled. Not with noise, but with evidence. Not with heat, but with silence that made people lean in. In the corner, the campaign's polling analyst pulled up the latest overnight data. AOC's approval numbers were up, not just among her base, but among moderates. Even in counties that hadn't swung blue in decades. She hadn't asked for applause, but people were listening. And the advisor who'd been in the room when Trump first dismissed the story, the one who'd laughed when she entered the hearing with just a red folder, now stared at the wall and said what no one wanted to hear. She's not trying to go viral. A pause. She's changing the temperature of the country. And that's when someone finally said the words aloud, not sarcastically, not dramatically, but like someone stating the weather after opening a window. We're screwed. There's a different kind of silence inside the Trump camp now. Not the charged, combative kind. This one feels more like the moment after a dam breaks and you realize just how long the water's been rising. In a back office of the campaign's Florida headquarters, the inner circle is down to murmurs. The loudest voice in the room, his, is in another wing, still pacing, still fuming. But here, among the aides who actually read the memos and built the slide decks, reality is sinking in. Not in one sweeping moment, but in pieces. A senior communications staffer who's been with him since 2015 sets down his phone. His voice is quiet, as if saying it any louder might make it less true. We summarized everything. He never read. Another nods slowly without meeting anyone's eyes. He liked how it sounded, never asked what it meant. They're not accusing, just observing. The statement isn't new. What's new is how it lands now. In the wake of a tape that wasn't spun or twisted, just played. And in that simple act, something fragile shattered. The illusion of intention. What he said wasn't a misstep or a one-time slip. It was a window. And now the public wasn't just peering through it. They were standing inside. Someone finally speaks the question hanging in the air. How much else did he approve without understanding? The strategist leans back, eyes unfocused. Policy, speeches, executive orders, all signed, all amplified. But how many of them did he truly grasp? There's no answer. Just the hum of a nearby printer kicking on, like the building itself is trying to fill the void. Across the country, people are dissecting every syllable from that recording. Legal scholars highlight the implications. Teachers use it in civics lessons. Retirees rewatch it in silence. And the comment sections, usually chaotic and cruel, hold an unusual stillness. Because whether you admired her or not, something in AOC's delivery cut through the static. She didn't point fingers. She didn't raise her voice. She just let the words, his words, fall into the room and do what they were always meant to do. Speak for themselves. One junior staffer, maybe too young to hide his reaction, looks up from his laptop. The worst part wasn't what was said, it's that we all kind of knew. That stops the room, not because it's offensive, but because it's honest. The campaign had spent years weaving narratives, reacting to headlines, leaning into chaos. But now those tools feel blunt, clumsy. Because the opponent didn't come with a louder megaphone, she came with patience, with precision, with a confidence that didn't seek to dominate, but to outlast. Another aide scrolls through social media. Posts keep flooding in. Not all celebratory, not all condemnatory. Many are just reflective. People asking each other what they missed, why they didn't notice before. And that's the shift that unsettles the room most. The public isn't just reacting, they're remembering. In contrast, Trump's latest outburst is already losing oxygen. Another string of caps lock posts, another claim of victimhood. But none of it hits the way it used to. Because now people have a reference point. They've heard what he says when he thinks no one's listening, and seen what she does when everyone is. AOC hasn't posted a word since the hearing, and that silence, It's louder than any press conference. She's controlling the narrative, someone murmurs. No, another corrects gently. She's refusing to compete in his game. And somehow, that's winning. They sit with that for a moment. Outside the window, the Florida sun is too bright for how somber everything feels. And somewhere in the back, a campaign assistant, who's barely said a word all day, whispers almost to herself. He thought being in charge meant being the loudest. She knew it meant being the clearest. No one disagrees. It didn't start with a mass firing. It started with a hallway. Just past midnight, footsteps echoed down the marbled corridor at Mar-a-Lago. A senior aide, one who had once hand-fed quotes to journalists and monitored every breath of the online cycle, was told his badge would no longer open the West Wing doors. No explanation, just a cold escort in the familiar phrase, "The president has decided." The next morning, two more were gone. One had helped craft campaign strategy in 3 states. The other handled press coordination during the pandemic. Both disappeared from the internal roster before sunrise. By noon, the staff was walking lighter, speaking in whispers, checking their phones more than usual. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the knowledge that the line between staying and vanishing was no longer about competence. It was about loyalty. And loyalty now meant pretending. Trump had made it clear: defend, deny, deflect. No nuance, no hesitation. Anyone who hesitated was tainted. And anyone who remembered differently than he did, well, they weren't part of the mission. But missions require maps, and more, the team felt like they were being asked to walk blindfolded across a minefield. The leaks didn't come from bitterness. Not at first. They came from exhaustion. Quiet voices on encrypted apps, typed in lowercase to avoid attention. Sent not to blow up the campaign, but to step outside the fog of denial. She was right, one message read, later quoted anonymously in a Washington Post op-ed. He wasn't listening. We were all pretending. Another aide forwarded an old voice memo to a trusted friend in media. It was dated a year ago. The voice was unmistakably Trump's, rambling through a draft speech, ignoring notes, ad-libbing policy changes because they'll eat it up. The friend didn't publish the tape, but she told a few others she had it. And just like that, the fear shifted. The threat was no longer AOC's folder. It was memory. The things staffers had once brushed off or buried. Those things were resurfacing. And worse, they were being whispered by people inside. He doesn't know what's real, one former campaign official texted a colleague. And now we're being told to call the truth sabotage. It wasn't sabotage. It was quiet dissent. Some staff stayed, some left. But those who stayed stopped looking each other in the eye. Because everyone remembered where they had been when the tape played. Everyone remembered the way AOC paused, not to humiliate, but to reveal. And how none of them had prepared for that. Not with data, not with noise, not even with denials. AOC had made space. And in that space, something had begun to unravel, not just in the public, but within the walls of power itself. Even conservative columnists started choosing their words more carefully. One tweeted, "The problem wasn't the tape, it was that it confirmed what many feared, a man leading with impulse, not understanding." Inside Trump's orbit, the reaction wasn't rage. It was a search for someone to blame. And so the firings continued, each one quieter than the last, each done in the hope that maybe cutting off the bleeding limb would stop the hemorrhage. But the real damage wasn't from the exits. It was from what they left behind. Notes, memories, fragments of truth. A junior researcher, barely 2 years out of college, forwarded a news clip to her mother and added, "This isn't what I signed up for." Her mother replied with 3 words, "You still have time." AOC said nothing that week. No tweets, no press conferences, no victory lap. She let the silence speak, and it did. Not because it was louder than Trump, but because it outlasted him. By the end of the week, no one was certain how many staff had been dismissed. The numbers changed with every report. What didn't change was the feeling. Something had shifted, not just publicly, but internally. The fear wasn't just about what AOC would release next. It was about what they'd all chosen to ignore. In a sunlit classroom just outside St. Louis, A civics teacher draws a small circle on the whiteboard and writes one word in the center: accountability. Around it, students scribble their own terms: power, silence, truth, noise, platform. Their desks are arranged in a loose semicircle. On one side of the board is the school's American flag, faded slightly from time. On the other, a paused screenshot from the viral hearing. AOC mid-sentence, the red folder in her hands. It's the third day in a row the class has returned to the moment that stopped a presidency in its tracks. But today, the teacher doesn't replay the tape. Instead, she asks, "What do you think this moment will mean 20 years from now?" A hand goes up from the back, a boy who rarely speaks. "It depends on what we do with it," he says. "If we just move on, then it won't mean much." A quiet nod from the teacher. Exactly. Across the country in a community college in Arizona, another classroom is mid-discussion. The professor pulls up a clip from Fox News, not to critique the coverage, but to contrast it. She pairs it with a podcast from a grassroots journalist who broke down the audio's legal implications. Then she turns to her students and says, "Civic memory doesn't form by accident. It's shaped by who we choose to quote." In Philadelphia, a retired attorney volunteers in an adult GED class. After playing the clip, he doesn't ask what students think. He asks, "What would you have done if you were in that room?" One woman answers, "I don't think I'd speak, but I'd want someone like her to speak for me." In hallway conversations between classes, the tape becomes shorthand. "Did you see when she didn't flinch? Did you hear how quiet he got?" The pause after the tape, that said everything. In a school library in Mississippi, a ninth-grade girl sketches in her notebook. Her drawing is simple: a microphone unplugged, resting on a table. Above it, she writes, "It was never about volume. It was about value." Teachers across the nation adapt their lesson plans, not just to dissect policy, but to explore courage, to invite debate, to confront the uncomfortable truth that accountability doesn't come wrapped in applause. It often arrives dressed as disruption. A civics teacher in Chicago puts it this way: "The issue isn't just what he said, it's that so many believed no one would ever challenge him. That impunity was part of the expectation." One student asks, "Why didn't anyone stop him before?" The teacher pauses, then answers gently, "Sometimes we don't realize the cost of silence until someone breaks it." AOC's moment in that chamber is no longer just a news story. It's a case study, a flashpoint, a question mark passed between generations. Not because it was perfect, but because it was planted, with care, in a soil too long left unattended. A middle school teacher in Seattle uses the hearing to teach about tone, how AOC's voice never rose, yet the impact deepened. They compare it to historical speeches, noting that change doesn't always shout. Some students are inspired, others feel conflicted, but none are indifferent, and that's the point. In a rural town in Kentucky, a homeschool parent uses the transcript to talk about evidence. Her daughter, age 12, asks, "Why do people get so mad at truth?" The mother doesn't answer right away. She just says, "Let's read it again." The conversation continues, in libraries and lunchrooms, in group chats and family dinners. It's no longer just about one tape. It's about who we let speak and who we listen to after the noise fades. In one school, a student leaves a sticky note on the bulletin board where the words "Speak Up" are posted. The note simply reads, "She didn't just speak. She reminded us that we still can." And maybe that's the quiet revolution: one classroom, one question, one voice at a time. The folding chairs were mismatched. A few still bore scuff marks from school dances past. The community gym in the Bronx wasn't dressed for politics. It never had to be. Fluorescent lights hummed quietly above, and the walls echoed the faint smell of floor polish and basketballs. No banners, no podium, just a circle of chairs and a shared understanding. People came here not to be impressed, but to be heard. AOC sat among them, not in front, not elevated, just in the circle. Her folder lay unopened on her lap. She greeted people by name where she could, and when she couldn't, she still looked each one in the eye. There were no cameras. Only one reporter had shown up, notebook tucked loosely under her arm. She didn't even take it out. The congresswoman didn't name Trump. Didn't need to. The room already knew. This isn't about one man, she said quietly, almost like she was still forming the thought as she spoke it. It's about every time a paper is signed that shifts someone's future, without them even knowing their name was on it. A woman from Castle Hill raised her hand. She didn't have a question, just a memory. When my husband was deported, the only paper I saw was a copy. His name was spelled wrong. AOC didn't interrupt, just nodded, listening. Another woman, retired teacher, gray curls and tired hands, spoke next. My pension paperwork took 6 years to correct. 6 years. They said the delay was routine. She paused. You reminded me that silence isn't routine. It's strategy. That line lingered. A young man, maybe early 20s, leaned forward. I didn't vote before. I thought it wouldn't matter. But I watched that clip, and you didn't yell. You just showed it, like a mirror. And it made me want to be in the room next time. There was no applause, just breathe. The kind of quiet that wraps around truth when people realize they're not alone in carrying it. AOC looked around slowly before speaking again. Policy isn't paperwork, she said. It's people. And when systems don't see you, they expect you not to look back. She opened the folder, not to pull out another recording or statement, but to show a handwritten list. It was titled Missed Calls. Underneath were names and numbers from the last week. Veterans, small business owners, single mothers, teenagers. Every call back is a beginning, she said, and every story reminds me why truth isn't always loud. It's persistent. There was a man near the exit, hadn't spoken the whole time, wore a jacket with a patch from a factory that closed years ago. Before leaving, he stepped forward. My brother voted for Trump. I didn't. We don't agree on much. But we both watched the hearing, and for the first time, he didn't defend what he saw. He just sat there. His voice cracked. He just sat there. Someone in the back whispered, that says everything. As people stood to leave, there were no chants, no slogans, just folded chairs and soft thank yous. No one asked for a selfie. Some didn't even say goodbye, but they left slower than they arrived. And outside in the cool evening air, a woman carrying groceries turned to her teenage son and said, she didn't raise her voice once. He replied, she didn't have to. Sometimes town halls don't echo with volume. They echo with stillness, with the quiet knowing that something shifted, not because someone demanded it, but because someone reminded them they were already allowed to ask for more. She walked without hurry, the pavement still warm beneath her shoes, though the sun had already dipped behind the Capitol dome. The building, towering and white, didn't glow tonight. It simply sat, massive, historical, indifferent. Tourists were gone. Staffers were inside arguing over language. But out here it was quiet, not silence that felt empty, but the kind that lets your own thoughts finally catch up. AOC had her earbuds in. The world assumed she'd be listening to interviews, analysis, maybe campaign clips. But tonight it was the tape, again, just once more. Not for anger, not even for strategy, just to remember what she saw in that moment that millions hadn't yet. The tremble not in Trump's voice, but in what he avoided saying. As the familiar static filled her ears, her eyes didn't narrow. They softened. She crossed her arms gently as if folding into a memory. A breeze lifted the edge of her coat. Somewhere nearby, a bus screeched to a halt. She didn't flinch. She whispered, so quiet only the sidewalk heard. Truth doesn't need volume, just timing. Then she pressed pause. The city buzzed faintly, life carrying on as usual. AOC turned the corner. She didn't look back. And for once, neither did the camera. This story reminds us that real power isn't always loud. It's often found in clarity, timing, and the quiet courage to act when it matters most. AOC's restraint wasn't weakness, it was discipline. She didn't seek to embarrass, but to expose a pattern that too many had accepted as normal. In a world obsessed with outrage, her silence between the words became the loudest part. What struck me most wasn't the tape, it was the stillness that followed, the pause that made millions reflect not just on Trump, but on ourselves. What we tolerate, what we excuse, what we're afraid to confront. Question for you. When was the last time silence made you stop and really think? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.